In the summer of 1944, as Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in human history, German commanders remained convinced the real attack would come elsewhere. They kept their best divisions waiting near Calais, certain that Normandy was merely a diversion. They were wrong. And they were wrong because of intelligence so secret that even the soldiers dying on those beaches had no idea it existed. That intelligence came from a mansion in the English countryside where a strange machine clicked and whirred around the clock. And the man who designed that machine was considered so peculiar, so difficult, so utterly unlike a proper British officer that many wondered if he belonged in uniform at all. He wore rumpled clothes. He tied his coffee mug to a radiator with a padlock so no one would steal it. He sometimes ran to meetings instead of driving. He talked to colleagues in a high-pitched voice that made some people uncomfortable. And he was about to save Western civilization. His name was Alan Turing. He built a computer before computers existed, and the nation he saved would ultimately destroy him for a crime that was no crime at all. This is the story of how a mathematician with no military training defeated the most sophisticated encryption system the world had ever seen. It is a story of genius operating in secrecy, of machines that thought faster than humans, of codes that were supposed to be unbreakable. It is also a story of betrayal and injustice that haunts Britain to this day. It is the story of how intelligence won the Second World War. By the spring of 1940, the situation facing Britain was nothing short of catastrophic. France had fallen in 6 devastating weeks. Its supposedly impregnable Maginot Line simply bypassed by German panzer divisions racing through Belgium and the Ardennes forest. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, leaving behind almost all its heavy equipment. 300,000 soldiers had been saved, but they returned home without weapons, without vehicles, without tanks. Britain stood alone against the most powerful military machine Europe had ever seen. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic in growing numbers, operating from newly captured bases on the French coast that put them hundreds of miles closer to the shipping lanes. They were sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. The island nation depended entirely on imports for survival: food, fuel, weapons, raw materials. Everything that kept Britain fighting had to cross an ocean that was becoming a graveyard for Allied shipping. Without American grain, Britain would starve. Without oil from Venezuela and the Middle East, the Royal Navy would be paralyzed and the Royal Air Force grounded. Without steel, aluminum, and machine tools from North America, British factories could not produce the weapons needed to continue the fight. The U-boats operated in wolf packs, groups of submarines that would spread across the shipping lanes and converge on any convoy they detected. When a submarine spotted a convoy, it would shadow the merchant ships while radioing their position to headquarters. Other submarines would race to intercept, and then the pack would attack together, usually at night when they were nearly invisible on the surface. A single night's attack could sink a dozen ships or more. The Atlantic became littered with debris, oil slicks, and the bodies of drowned sailors, and those submarines were communicating with their headquarters using a cipher that the best minds in British intelligence could not crack. The Germans called their encryption machine Enigma. It looked like an oversized typewriter compact enough to fit in a briefcase, elegant in its mechanical simplicity, but the mathematics behind it were staggering. When an operator pressed a key, electrical current flowed through a series of rotating wheels, each containing a different scrambled alphabet. The signal then passed through a plugboard that swapped additional letters before returning through the wheels and illuminating a lamp showing the encrypted character. Every single keystroke changed the internal configuration. The same letter pressed twice in succession would produce 2 completely different outputs. The machine had been invented by a German engineer named Arthur Scherbius shortly after the First World War. He had originally marketed it to businesses for protecting commercial secrets. The German military recognized its potential and adopted it in the 1920s, adding refinements that made it even more secure. The plugboard was a particularly devastating addition. It allowed operators to swap pairs of letters before the message even entered the rotors, adding another layer of complexity that seemed to defy any mathematical attack. The number of possible settings was astronomical: 159 million combinations. To test every possibility by hand would take longer than the age of the universe. The Germans changed their settings every 24 hours, meaning that even if someone somehow found the correct configuration, it would be useless by the following morning. Their confidence was not arrogance. It was based on solid mathematics. The Enigma should have been unbreakable. German commanders transmitted their most sensitive military secrets through it without hesitation. U-boat positions, attack orders, convoy interception coordinates, troop movements, supply logistics. The entire German war machine ran on Enigma encrypted communications. Submarines in the Atlantic received their orders through Enigma. Tank divisions rolling across Europe coordinated their attacks through Enigma. Even the Luftwaffe used Enigma to direct bomber formations. If Britain could read those messages, the war might be won. If Britain could not, the war would almost certainly be lost. The stakes were not abstract. In the first months of 1940, German submarines were sinking merchant ships at a terrifying rate. Britain imported nearly half its food and most of its raw materials. Without the convoys from America and Canada, the island would starve. Without fuel oil, the Royal Navy would be immobilized. Without steel and aluminum, aircraft factories would fall silent. Winston Churchill later wrote that the only thing that really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that Britain's survival depended on winning the Battle of the Atlantic. And winning the Battle of the Atlantic meant breaking Enigma. Into this desperate situation came a young mathematician who had never fired a weapon and had no interest in military protocol. Alan Turing was born on June 23, 1912, in London, while his father was on leave from the Indian Civil Service. His parents spent much of Alan's childhood in India, leaving him and his older brother John to be raised by foster families in England. It was a lonely upbringing that perhaps contributed to the independence of mind he would display throughout his life. From his earliest years, Turing showed signs of extraordinary intelligence. He reportedly taught himself to read in just 3 weeks. He had an almost obsessive fascination with numbers and puzzles, spending hours working through problems that other children his age could not begin to understand. His mind worked differently, always searching for patterns beneath the surface, always questioning assumptions that everyone else accepted without thought. In 1926, at the age of 13, Turing enrolled at Sherborne School, a prestigious boarding school in Dorset. The first day of term coincided with the general strike, which had shut down the railway system across Britain. Most students simply waited for transportation to resume. Not Turing. So determined was he to attend his first day that he rode his bicycle, unaccompanied 63 miles from Southampton to Sherborne, stopping overnight at the Crown Hotel in Blandford Forum. The local newspaper reported on the feat. It was the first public glimpse of a determination that would later change history. At Sherborne, Turing's brilliance in mathematics clashed with a school system that emphasized classical education above all else. His headmaster wrote to his parents with barely concealed frustration, "If he is to stay at public school, he must aim at becoming educated. If he is to be solely a scientific specialist, he is wasting his time at a public school." The message was clear. Mathematics was not considered proper education for a gentleman. Turing ignored the criticism entirely. In 1927, at the age of 15, he was solving advanced mathematical problems without having studied even elementary calculus. His teachers had never seen anything like it. At Sherborne, Turing formed a deep friendship with another student named Christopher Morcom, who shared his passion for science and mathematics. Some biographers believe Turing was in love with Morcom, though the feelings may not have been reciprocated. Whatever the exact nature of their bond, Morcom's sudden death on February 13, 1930 from tuberculosis devastated Turing. He was 18 years old. The loss would haunt him for the rest of his life and perhaps drove him even deeper into the world of abstract mathematics, where grief could be transformed into equations. In 1931, Turing entered King's College, Cambridge, to study mathematics. He thrived in the university environment, finally surrounded by minds that could engage with his ideas. In 1936, at the age of 23, he published a paper that would prove to be one of the most important documents in the history of computing. It was titled Uncomputable Numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungsproblem. The title was dense with mathematical jargon, but the concept at its heart was revolutionary. Turing had imagined a theoretical machine, now called a Turing machine, that could perform any mathematical calculation that could be precisely defined. It consisted of an infinitely long tape divided into cells, each containing a symbol, and a reading head that could move along the tape, reading symbols, writing new ones, and following a set of instructions. This abstract device, existing only on paper, contained the essential principles of every computer that would ever be built. Turing had invented the concept of programmable computing before the first electronic computer existed. From 1936 to 1938, Turing studied at Princeton University in the United States, earning his doctorate in mathematics. He worked alongside some of the greatest mathematical minds in the world. He also studied cryptology, the science of codes and ciphers. It was expertise that would soon prove more valuable than anyone could have imagined. In 1938, Turing returned to Cambridge and began working part-time for the Government Code and Cipher School, a secretive organization responsible for breaking foreign communications. War with Germany seemed increasingly likely. Britain needed people who understood both advanced mathematics and the art of cryptanalysis. Turing was perhaps the only person in the country who understood both at the highest level. When war broke out on September 3, 1939, Turing reported the very next day to Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire that had been secretly purchased by the government the previous year. The estate had been acquired from the Leon family, who had built an eclectic mix of buildings on the property over the decades. Located about 50 miles northwest of London, with good railway connections to both the capital and the university towns of Oxford and Cambridge, it would become the nerve center of British code-breaking for the duration of the war. The Government Code and Cipher School, as the code-breaking organization was officially known, had been recruiting for months before war began. They sought mathematicians, linguists, and chess players. They placed cryptic crossword puzzles in the Daily Telegraph to identify people with the right kind of lateral thinking ability. Winners were discreetly approached and invited to interview for unspecified government work. They recruited dons from Cambridge and Oxford, young women from good families, anyone who showed aptitude for the peculiar mental gymnastics that code-breaking demanded. At its peak, nearly 10,000 people would work at Bletchley Park and its associated outstations. But when Turing arrived in September 1939, the operation was tiny, numbering perhaps 200 staff working in cramped conditions with inadequate resources. They set up operations in the mansion house itself and in a scattering of huts that were hastily constructed on the grounds. The wooden huts were freezing in winter, stifling in summer, always crowded, often noisy. Conditions were primitive, but the work was vital. Turing was assigned to tackle the naval Enigma, which was considered the most difficult variant. The German Navy used additional rotors and followed stricter operating procedures than the Army or Air Force. Breaking naval Enigma would provide intelligence on U-boat operations, the single most critical intelligence target in the entire war. First Sea Lord Sir Dudley Pound stated the stakes with brutal clarity. If we lose the war at sea, we lose the war. Fortunately, Turing did not start from nothing. Polish cryptanalysts had been working on Enigma since the early 1930s. Three brilliant mathematicians named Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rosicki, and Henryk Zagalski had achieved remarkable breakthroughs, even building a mechanical device called a Bombe that could test possible Enigma settings. Rejewski, working with extraordinary insight and limited information, had essentially reverse-engineered the Enigma machine using mathematical analysis and a single piece of intelligence about the internal wiring of the rotors provided by a French spy. The Polish success was remarkable. For several years in the mid-1930s, they had been reading German military communications that the rest of the world believed to be completely secure. But in 1938, the Germans had increased Enigma's complexity, adding 2 additional rotors to the 3 already in use, and changing their operating procedures. The number of possible configurations increased dramatically. The Polish methods, which had required testing every combination of 3 rotors from a set of 3, now had to contend with choosing 3 rotors from a set of 5. The Bombe machines could not keep up. The Poles were blinded. Just weeks before the German invasion of Poland, in September 1939, the Polish cryptanalysts made a decision that altered history. Knowing their country was about to be destroyed, they shared everything they had learned with British and French intelligence. At a secret meeting in the Pyry Forest near Warsaw, they handed over replica Enigma machines they had built and detailed documentation of their methods. Rejewski later explained that it was not technical difficulties that prompted them to share their secrets. Even if they had faced no obstacles at all, they would still have shared everything as their contribution to the fight against Germany. The Polish contribution was invaluable, providing a foundation that British codebreakers could build upon. Rejewski, Rosicki, and Zagalski managed to escape Poland after the German invasion. They continued working on Enigma in France until that country fell as well. Rejewski and Zagalski eventually reached Britain via Spain and North Africa, though the British government, apparently worried about security, never assigned them to Bletchley Park. Rosicki drowned in 1942 when the ship carrying him across the Mediterranean was sunk. Today, a memorial at Bletchley Park honors these barely known Polish heroes whose work made everything that followed possible. Turing immediately set to work designing a new machine that could crack the enhanced Enigma. He called it the Bombe, an anglicization of the Polish Bombe. But his design was fundamentally different, exploiting mathematical principles that went far beyond what the Poles had achieved. The key insight was the use of cribs, fragments of plain text that could be guessed with reasonable confidence. German military communications followed predictable patterns. Weather reports were transmitted at regular times with standard formats. Messages often began with the same routine phrases. If a codebreaker could guess even a small portion of the original message, they had a starting point for attack. Turing realized that the Enigma's complexity could be turned against itself. The machine would never encrypt a letter as itself. If you pressed the letter A, the output might be any letter from B to Z, but it would never be A. The seemingly minor property, combined with a clever technique using what cryptanalysts called loops, meant that vast numbers of potential settings could be eliminated very quickly. A machine that could test these possibilities at high speed might be able to find the correct settings before the Germans changed them the next day. Another Cambridge mathematician named Gordon Welchman contributed a crucial refinement. The Enigma's plug board, which swapped pairs of letters before and after the main encryption, had a reciprocal property. If A was connected to B, then B was also connected to A. Welchman invented what he called the diagonal board, an addition to Turing's design that exploited this reciprocity to dramatically reduce the number of false results. When Welchman showed his idea to Turing, the latter was initially skeptical, but after studying the diagrams, Turing became as excited as Welchman himself. The improvement was spectacular. The engineering design and construction of the Bombe was handled by Harold Keane at the British Tabulating Machine Company in Letchworth. Each machine was enormous, standing about 7 feet tall, 6 feet wide, and 2 feet deep, weighing approximately 1 ton. The front was covered with rotating drums, arranged in groups of 3 to simulate the 3 rotors of an Enigma machine. When running, the drums spun through every possible position, testing potential settings at a rate no human could match. The noise was tremendous, a constant clicking and whirring that gave the machine its name. Some said it sounded like a knitting machine operated by 1,000 frantic grandmothers. The first Bombe, codenamed Victory, was installed at Bletchley Park on March 14, 1940. It worked, but the early results were disappointing. The machine found the correct settings, but it also produced too many false positives that had to be checked by hand. It was not until Welchman's diagonal board was incorporated into an improved machine named Agnes Day, operational on August 8, 1940, that the Bombe became truly effective. From that point forward, the tide began to turn. Operating the bombs became the responsibility of the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens, as they were called. These young women, most of them barely out of their teens, worked in darkened rooms for 8-hour shifts, tending machines that they were forbidden to understand. They would receive a menu, a set of instructions for configuring the bomb drums, from the cryptanalysts. They would set up the machine, start it running, and wait for it to stop. When it did, they would record the position of the drums and send the information back to the code breakers for verification. It was tedious, exhausting work. The machines generated tremendous heat and made a constant racket. The Wrens worked 3 rotating shifts covering 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They were not told what the machines did or why their work mattered. They simply followed orders with exemplary discipline. By the end of the war, more than 1,600 Wrens were operating over 200 bomb machines at Bletchley Park and its satellite stations. Gordon Welchman later described them as the unsung heroines of the code-breaking effort. The culture Turing created in Hut 8 was unlike anything else in the rigidly hierarchical British military establishment. Rank meant very little. Ideas meant everything. Officers and civilians worked side by side without the usual formality. Turing never demanded to be addressed by title. He did not care about polished shoes or pressed uniforms. He wanted solutions, not salutes. The atmosphere was intellectual, intense, and occasionally chaotic. Colleagues might find Turing sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers, muttering to himself as he worked through a particularly difficult problem. They learned to recognize when he was deep in thought and not to disturb him. Do you think institutions today give enough credit to unconventional thinkers who break the rules to solve problems? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The work was intellectually demanding and emotionally draining. Every failed decryption attempt could mean another convoy attacked, another ship torpedoed, and more sailors drowning in the freezing Atlantic. Success meant lives saved, but no one outside the perimeter fence could ever know about it. The pressure was relentless, and yet Turing seemed to thrive in it. His management style bewildered those accustomed to military hierarchy. He once arrived at a meeting with his trousers held up by a piece of string because he could not find his belt. He would bicycle to work wearing a gas mask during hay fever season. He buried silver ingots in the woods as insurance against a German invasion, then forgot exactly where he had put them. Such eccentricities would have ended most careers, but Turing's results protected him from those who questioned his methods. His colleagues found him eccentric but brilliant beyond measure. Joan Clark, a fellow cryptanalyst who briefly became engaged to Turing before he broke off the relationship after revealing his homosexuality, described him as possessed of a remarkable mind that could hold multiple complex problems simultaneously. The team he assembled was extraordinary. Hugh Alexander, who had been British chess champion in 1938 and would win the title again in 1956, Sean Wiley, a mathematician who would later become chief mathematician at GCHQ. These were not ordinary men, and Turing inspired them to achieve things that seemed mathematically impossible. By the summer of 1941, Hut 8 was regularly breaking German naval Enigma messages, though often with delays of days or even weeks. The intelligence, codenamed Ultra, was beginning to make a difference in the Battle of the Atlantic. Convoys could be routed around known U-boat positions. Merchant ship losses dropped by more than 2/3 in July 1941 compared to earlier in the year. The impact was immediate and measurable. In the first half of 1941, before Ultra intelligence became reliable, German submarines had been sinking an average of 50 ships per month. After the breakthrough, that number plummeted. Convoy after convoy sailed safely through waters that had previously been killing grounds. The Admiralty's submarine tracking room, which received decrypted messages from Bletchley Park, could now plot the positions of U-boat patrol lines and direct convoys around them. Ships that would have been torpedoed completed their voyages. Supplies that would have been lost reached British ports. Sailors who would have drowned lived to see their families again. The Germans noticed that something had changed. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, became increasingly puzzled by British convoy routing that seemed almost prescient. Time after time, his carefully positioned submarine lines waited in vain for convoys that never appeared. When he asked his cryptographic experts whether Enigma had been compromised, they assured him it was mathematically impossible. The British must have developed better direction-finding equipment, they concluded. Or perhaps they had spies in French ports. The true explanation never occurred to them. But in October 1941, Turing and 3 colleagues took an extraordinary risk. They wrote a letter directly to Prime Minister Winston Churchill, bypassing the entire chain of command. The letter detailed critical shortages of staff and equipment that were hampering their work. They needed more bomb machines. They needed more personnel to operate them. They needed these things immediately. Stuart Milner Barry, one of the 4 signatories, was chosen to deliver the letter by hand to 10 Downing Street. He later recalled the surreal experience of hailing a taxi in London and asking to be taken to the Prime Minister's residence. He walked through a wooden barrier manned by a single policeman, rang the doorbell, and handed the letter to Churchill's private secretary with an explanation that it was urgent and secret. Churchill read the letter and responded instantly. He scrawled a note to his chief military assistant, General Hastings Ismay, with the instruction, "Action, this day. Make sure they have all they want on extreme priority and report to me that this has been done." The effect was immediate. Within weeks, new bombing machines were being ordered, additional staff was being recruited, and the bottlenecks that had been frustrating the codebreakers began to disappear. Churchill later called the Bletchley Park staff the geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled. Then, on February 1st, 1942, disaster struck. The German Navy introduced a 4th rotor to its Enigma machines for U-boat communications. The existing bombs, designed for 3-rotor Enigma, were suddenly useless against the most important target. The new cipher, which the Germans called Triton and the British called Shark, plunged Allied intelligence into darkness. For 10 agonizing months, convoys sailed blindly into U-boat ambush zones. Shipping losses soared to catastrophic levels. The numbers told the story. In November 1942 alone, German submarines sank over 700,000 tons of Allied shipping. Month after month, the losses continued. Hundreds of ships went down. Thousands of sailors drowned in the freezing Atlantic. Vital supplies that Britain desperately needed ended up scattered across the ocean floor. The U-boats seemed invincible, materializing from nowhere to strike and then vanishing back into the depths. By March 1943, so many ships were being sunk that Britain genuinely considered whether it could continue the war. The supply situation had become desperate. Fuel reserves were critically low. Some officials discussed abandoning the convoy system entirely and sending ships across the Atlantic individually, hoping that at least some would get through. It was a measure of desperation that defied military logic but reflected the depth of the crisis. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. On October 30th, 1942, 2 sailors from the destroyer HMS Petard made a decision that would change history. The ship had been hunting a German submarine, U-59, in the Mediterranean near Port Said. After a prolonged depth charge attack, the submarine was forced to surface. The German crew abandoned ship, expecting their vessel to sink quickly. Lieutenant Anthony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier spotted an opportunity. Without waiting for orders, they stripped off their clothes and swam to the stricken vessel through oil-covered waters. Working in pitch darkness as the submarine slowly flooded, they located the captain's cabin, broke open the locked cabinets with a machine gun, and began passing documents up to a 16-year-old canteen assistant named Tommy Brown, who had followed them aboard despite having no authorization to do so. The water was rising rapidly. The submarine was clearly sinking. But Fasson and Grazier kept working, kept passing up papers, determined to retrieve everything they could. They drowned when the submarine suddenly plunged beneath the waves. They never knew that the documents they died to retrieve contained the weather code book and other materials needed to break Triton. Fasson and Grazier were posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's second highest award for gallantry. Brown received the George Medal. He survived the war only to die on February 13, 1945, from injuries sustained while rescuing his sister from a house fire. He was just 18 years old. Using the captured materials, Turing's team finally cracked the 4-rotor naval Enigma. By December 1942, shipping losses began to fall again. In May 1943, the month known to German submariners as Black May, losses among U-boats became so severe that Admiral Karl Donitz withdrew them from the North Atlantic entirely. The Battle of the Atlantic was won. Britain would survive. The intelligence from Bletchley Park went far beyond submarine warfare. By 1944, the codebreakers were decrypting thousands of messages every day. They knew the strength, location, and intentions of German forces across Europe. They knew what Hitler's generals were telling him and what he was telling them. This intelligence was absolutely crucial to the planning and execution of D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy. By June 6, 1944, the 7,000-strong workforce at Bletchley Park was processing nearly 5,000 Enigma messages daily. The intelligence they produced told Allied commanders exactly where every German division in France was located. Bletchley had identified all 58 German divisions in France and the Low Countries. They knew the disposition of panzer forces that might counterattack the beaches. They knew which units were under strength and which were at full fighting capacity. The codebreakers at Bletchley took extraordinary measures in the weeks surrounding D-Day. Normally, intercepted messages were picked up by listening stations scattered across Britain and transmitted to Bletchley for decryption. But in the critical period, from May through July 1944, Bletchley Park took the risk of intercepting enemy messages directly on site in order to speed up the process. Secret listeners in Hut 18 monitored German Enigma traffic around the clock to track the response to the invasion, any threats to the invasion fleet at sea, and the movement of troops in northern France. Timestamps on the messages show they were intercepted, decrypted, translated, and transmitted to Allied commanders within 2.5 hours. Speed was everything. Information that arrived too late was worthless. Perhaps most importantly, Bletchley Park intelligence confirmed that the Germans had swallowed the Allied deception operation codenamed Fortitude. The Allies had created an entirely fictitious army group, supposedly preparing to invade the Pas-de-Calais region, the shortest crossing point from England to France. General George Patton, the commander the Germans feared most, was placed in charge of this phantom force. Inflatable tanks were scattered across the English countryside near Dover. Fake radio traffic flooded the airwaves. German reconnaissance aircraft were allowed to photograph the decoys. Intercepted German communications revealed that Hitler and his commanders were completely convinced. They believed the massive force near Dover was the main invasion army. Even after the Normandy landings began, the Germans kept their best divisions waiting near Calais for an invasion that would never come. 15 panzer and infantry divisions remained frozen in place, waiting to repel an attack by an army that existed only in German imagination. Every day they waited was another day Allied forces could consolidate their beachhead, bring in reinforcements, and break out of Normandy. The Western Front Committee at Bletchley Park, established specifically to support D-Day planning, produced regular reports that gave Allied commanders an almost omniscient view of German defenses. They knew not just the locations of enemy units, but their strength, their equipment, their commanders, and their morale. They knew which roads were passable and which bridges had been damaged. They knew when German reinforcements were being moved and where they were going. Never before in military history had commanders possessed such detailed intelligence about their opponents. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, later wrote that the intelligence from Bletchley Park saved thousands of British and American lives. Historians estimate that the codebreakers shortened the war in Europe by 2 to 4 years. Some calculations suggest that 14 million lives were saved because the war ended when it did, rather than dragging on into 1946 or 47. Do you think the secrecy that protected this work was worth the cost of not being able to honor these people during their lifetimes? I would love to hear your perspective in the comments. When the war ended in May 1945, the staff at Bletchley Park faced a unique situation. Their work had been the most successful intelligence operation in history, but no one could ever know about it. Every person who had worked there had signed the Official Secrets Act. The penalty for disclosure was severe. Churchill ordered most of the bomb machines destroyed so they would not fall into Soviet hands during the emerging Cold War. The details of what had been accomplished were locked away in classified files. Veterans returned to civilian life unable to explain the most significant years of their careers. Husbands could not tell wives. Parents could not tell children. The secret held for 30 years. Turing received an Order of the British Empire in 1946 for his wartime services, but the citation was deliberately vague. It mentioned nothing about Enigma, nothing about code breaking, nothing about the machines that had helped win the war. No one outside a tiny circle of intelligence officials knew what he had actually done. He returned to academic life, first at the National Physical Laboratory in London, where he led the team designing the automatic computing engine, one of the first detailed designs for a stored program computer. His technical report, completed in 1946, described a machine more advanced than anything then in existence. Then, at the University of Manchester, Turing made pioneering contributions to what would become known as artificial intelligence. He was fascinated by the question of whether machines could genuinely think or merely simulate thinking. His 1950 paper Computing Machinery and Intelligence proposed what is now called the Turing test. If a human interrogator, communicating through a teletype with both a machine and a human, could not reliably distinguish which was which, the machine could be said to exhibit intelligent behavior. Philosophers and computer scientists still debate the implications of this idea today. In his final years, Turing turned his attention to mathematical biology, studying how patterns form in nature. Why does a tiger have stripes? Why does a sunflower arrange its seeds in spirals? Turing proposed that chemical reactions and diffusion could explain these phenomena, work that anticipated developments in complexity theory decades later. He was still publishing important papers, still pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, when his life was destroyed by a legal system that considered love a crime. And then, in January 1952, everything changed. Turing had begun a relationship with a 19-year-old unemployed man named Arnold Murray, whom he had met outside a cinema in Manchester the previous December. When Turing's house was burglarized on January 23rd by an acquaintance of Murray's, he reported the crime to police. During the investigation, details of his personal life emerged. Turing did not lie or hide. With what some have called self-destructive naivety, he simply told the police the truth about his relationship with Murray. He was arrested and charged with gross indecency under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, the same law that had been used to prosecute Oscar Wilde half a century earlier. Homosexuality was a criminal offense in Britain at the time, punishable by imprisonment. Both Turing and Murray were charged. The initial committal proceedings were held on February 27, 1952. Turing pleaded guilty on March 31st. The case attracted some attention in the press, though journalists had no idea of the defendant's wartime significance. They saw only a Cambridge mathematician facing charges for behavior that mainstream British society considered deviant and shameful. The judge offered Turing a choice between imprisonment and probation, with the condition that he undergo hormonal treatment designed to reduce his sexual urges. This so-called treatment, chemical castration in all but name, involved regular injections of diethylstilbestrol, a synthetic estrogen compound. Turing chose probation to avoid prison, likely hoping to continue his scientific work. But the effects of the hormone treatment were devastating. He experienced physical changes, including the growth of breast tissue and weight gain. His mental state deteriorated. Friends noticed that his characteristic energy and enthusiasm seemed diminished. The injections continued for a year, altering his body chemistry in ways that were not fully understood even by the doctors administering the treatment. His security clearance was revoked immediately upon his conviction, barring him from any classified work. He was officially considered a security risk, the irony apparently lost on the bureaucrats who made this determination. The man who had done more than perhaps anyone else to defeat Nazi Germany was now viewed as a potential threat to British security because of who he loved. He was even denied entry to the United States because of his criminal record, cutting him off from the international scientific community. Despite everything, Turing tried to continue his work. He refused to be defined by his conviction or his treatment. He traveled to Norway and the Mediterranean, countries that were more tolerant of homosexuality. He continued publishing papers. He consulted a psychiatrist with whom he developed a good relationship. Those who knew him saw someone trying to maintain his dignity in impossible circumstances. On June 7, 1954, Turing's housekeeper found him dead in his bed at his home in Wilmslow, Cheshire. He was 41 years old. A half-eaten apple lay beside him on the nightstand. A post-mortem examination found cyanide in his system. The official inquest ruled his death a suicide by cyanide poisoning, though the apple itself was never tested. His mother, Ethel Turing, always believed it was an accident. She knew that her son often conducted chemistry experiments at home, and she suggested he had inadvertently contaminated the apple with cyanide he was using in an electroplating apparatus. Some historians have noted that Turing showed no signs of preparing for death. He had made appointments for the following week. He had written notes about research he intended to pursue. His body was found in his usual sleeping position. Whether accident, suicide, or something else entirely, the truth will never be known with certainty. What is certain is that the nation Turing had helped save had driven him to despair. The man whose mind had defeated Nazi Germany was destroyed by laws that treated his very identity as a crime. He died in obscurity, his wartime work still classified, his scientific contributions underappreciated, his personal life considered shameful by the society he had protected. It was an ending of almost unbearable cruelty, a tragedy that cast a long shadow over British history. The chemical castration treatment had ended in April 1953, 1 year after his conviction. Some have suggested that his mental state improved after the treatment stopped, while others believe the lasting effects continued to torment him. Friends described him as alternating between periods of apparent normalcy and episodes of profound sadness. In the final weeks of his life, he visited a fortune teller at a seaside resort. According to witnesses, he emerged from the session pale and shaken, his cheerful mood completely transformed. What the fortune teller said to him remains unknown. His body was cremated on June 12, 1954. The ashes were scattered at Woking Crematorium, the same place where his father's ashes had been scattered a few years earlier. There was no public memorial, no official acknowledgement of his wartime service, no recognition that Britain had lost one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. The secret held. For decades, the story of Bletchley Park remained secret. It was not until 1974 when a former intelligence officer named Frederick Winterbotham published a book called The Ultra Secret that the public learned anything about what had happened in that Victorian mansion during the war. Even then, the full details emerged only slowly over subsequent decades as documents were gradually declassified and veterans felt free to share their memories. Renowned historians had written entire histories of the Second World War without once mentioning the most important intelligence operation of the conflict. As the truth came out, the injustice done to Turing became increasingly apparent. Here was a man who had done as much as anyone to defeat Nazi Germany, whose invention had saved countless lives, whose mathematical insights had changed the course of the war. And his country had prosecuted him, humiliated him, poisoned him with hormones, and driven him to an early death. The contrast between his contribution and his treatment was almost unbearable to contemplate. In 2009, following an online petition that gathered over 30,000 signatures, Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a formal apology on behalf of the British government. Thousands of people have come together to demand justice for Alan Turing and recognition of the appalling way he was treated, Brown wrote. While Turing was dealt with under the law of the time, and we cannot put the clock back, his treatment was, of course, utterly unfair. So, on behalf of the British government and all those who live freely thanks to Alan's work, I'm very proud to say we are sorry. You deserve so much better. It was welcome, but campaigners believed more was needed. An apology acknowledged wrongdoing, but did not erase the conviction. Turing remained, in the eyes of the law, a criminal. Pressure continued for a formal pardon. In December 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Alan Turing a posthumous royal pardon under the royal prerogative of mercy. It was only the fourth such pardon granted in the Queen's long reign. Justice Secretary Chris Grayling said that Turing deserved to be remembered and recognized for his fantastic contribution to the war effort and his legacy to science. A pardon from the Queen is a fitting tribute to an exceptional man. Prime Minister David Cameron added that Turing was a remarkable man who played a key role in saving this country in the Second World War. In 2017, the British Parliament passed what became known informally as the Alan Turing Law, which provided automatic posthumous pardons for men convicted under the same discriminatory laws. Thousands who had suffered the same injustice as Turing, men whose lives had been destroyed for loving other men, finally had their convictions officially erased. Some survivors were still alive to receive the news that their long-ago convictions had been expunged. For many families, it provided a measure of closure that had been denied for generations. But the recognition did not stop there. In 2019, the Bank of England announced that Alan Turing would appear on the new £50 note, the highest denomination in regular circulation. Governor Mark Carney said that Turing was an outstanding mathematician whose work has had an enormous impact on how we live today. The note entered circulation on June 23, 2021, which would have been Turing's 109th birthday. It features his portrait based on a 1951 photograph, images of the Bombe machine, mathematical formulas from his groundbreaking papers, and a quotation from an interview he gave in 1949. This is only a foretaste of what is to come, and only the shadow of what is going to be. Jeremy Fleming, director of GCHQ, the modern successor to Bletchley Park, said that Turing's appearance on the note confirms his status as one of the most iconic figures in the world. Turing was embraced for his brilliance and persecuted for being gay. His legacy is a reminder of the value of embracing all aspects of diversity, but also the work we still need to do to become truly inclusive. Today, Bletchley Park is a thriving heritage attraction. Hundreds of thousands of visitors walk the grounds where Turing and his colleagues worked. They see reconstructed bomb machines clicking through their calculations, their drums spinning just as they did 80 years ago. They read the stories of the nearly 10,000 people, 3/4 of them women, who kept the operation running around the clock. They learn about the Polish mathematicians whose early breakthroughs made everything else possible. And they confront the uncomfortable truth that the nation these people saved did not always treat them as heroes. The lessons of Alan Turing's life extend far beyond cryptography or computing. They speak to how societies treat those who do not fit conventional molds, those whose brilliance comes packaged with eccentricity, and those whose personal lives offend the prejudices of their time. They remind us that genius often comes in unexpected packages, that the person who seems strangest may see solutions that others cannot imagine. They warn us about the human cost of discrimination, about laws that punish identity rather than action. about the waste of human potential when we force people to hide who they are. The Alan Turing Institute, established in 2015 as Britain's National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence, carries forward his legacy of rigorous inquiry and computational thinking. The annual Turing Award, considered the Nobel Prize of Computing, has recognized the field's greatest contributors since 1966. Buildings, streets, and institutions around the world bear his name. In Manchester, a bronze statue depicts him sitting on a bench in Sackville Park, holding an apple, a poignant reference to the manner of his death. His impact on modern life is incalculable. Every computer, every smartphone, every mouse, every algorithm that shapes our digital world traces its conceptual lineage back to ideas that first took form in Turing's mind. The artificial intelligence systems that increasingly influence our lives began with questions he posed in 1950. The cybersecurity measures that protect our data evolved from principles he understood better than anyone of his generation. Turing died believing his greatest work would remain forever secret. He died carrying a criminal record for loving another man. He died without knowing that his name would one day be revered around the world, that his face would appear on currency, that laws would be named in his honor, that the institute bearing his name would become Britain's center for artificial intelligence research. The vindication came decades too late for the man himself. But for those who followed, for every person working in computer science today, for every life saved by Allied victory in the Second World War, the debt remains immeasurable. His story forces us to confront difficult questions. How many other brilliant minds were destroyed by the same laws? How much human potential was wasted? How many discoveries were never made? How many inventions never created because talented people were forced to hide who they were or were persecuted when they could not? The men convicted alongside Turing under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act numbered in the tens of thousands. Most of them were not mathematical geniuses. Most of them did not help win wars. But their suffering was just as real, their lives just as valuable, their treatment just as unjust. In that mansion in Buckinghamshire, in those cramped wooden huts where the air smelled of cigarette smoke and the machines never stopped clicking, a strange and brilliant man built a device that helped defeat fascism. The establishment dismissed his unconventional methods. The bureaucracy questioned his disheveled appearance. The law eventually criminalized his identity. And through it all, his machines kept running, kept testing combinations, kept finding the needles in mathematical haystacks that would save another convoy, protect another city, bring the war one day closer to its end. They ignored his computer. They dismissed his contributions. They punished him for being exactly who he was. And then, when the secrets finally came out, when the classified files were opened and the truth could no longer be denied, they realized that this peculiar mathematician with his coffee mug chained to the radiator and his trousers held up with string had changed the course of human history. The machines we use today, the computers that connect our world, the artificial intelligence systems that increasingly shape our lives, all of it traces back to ideas that first emerged in the mind of Alan Turing. Every time you use a smartphone, every time an algorithm processes your data, every time a computer solves a problem that would take humans lifetimes, you are living in the world that Turing imagined before anyone else could see it. His final years were marked by suffering, but his legacy endures in every calculation performed by every computer on Earth. His conviction has been erased, but his contributions can never be. His life was cut tragically short, but his ideas will shape technology for centuries to come. Trust your analysis. Follow the logic wherever it leads. Build machines that can solve problems humans cannot. And never let anyone tell you that being different is a weakness. The outsiders, the eccentrics, the ones who see what others cannot, they are often the ones who change the world. That was the lesson of Alan Turing. That was the lesson of Bletchley Park. That was the lesson of the machine that saved D-Day.